I will go ahead and get us started. Today, we are going to be going over the first part of chapter 1. I hope you guys were able to read some of that. And we're primarily going to be having discussions on what is a journalist, which sounds really silly because we all know what journalists are, especially since we want to become them, most of us. But we know that the definition of journalism is changing a lot in the industry. But before we get to that, I want to start a little practice that we will try to do at the beginning of every class called a newsroom huddle. A newsroom huddle, for those of you who have not been in a newsroom, whether digital or broadcast, is really the meetings that happen between news staff, which includes journalists, your news directors or editors, assignment editors, reporters, producers, photographers, videographers, and you all come together to decide what the news of the day is going to be. This is a really important part of any journalism field because it's how we decide what is news. And it's where we begin to understand what is considered newsworthy, what plays well with our other producers and reporters and administration. And so I want to start introducing a newsroom huddle exercise at the beginning of class for a couple of reasons. One, it helps get you into the swing of doing what we would do if we were an actual newsroom. We would come together, discuss the stories of the day, and discuss how we could pursue them. It also will give you practice pitching, which I know a lot of you talked about wanting to get more additional practice in pitching news. A lot of times we'll be talking about national stories. And so my pushback for your national pitches will be, okay, now how would you localize it? So how would you make this accessible to a Montevallo audience? So it will also help us to take national news and learn how we could localize it on our own. It should give us some story ideas that we could pursue later for feature pieces. And it will also help you with your current events quizzes because we'll be talking about events that are currently happening. So for each class, I'm going to come in and you'll see the newsroom huddle slide, and I'm going to say what my news director used to always say to us: what's going on in the world today? And then I'll pause and you will tell me what's going on in the world today. This will be part of a participation grade, so try to come in with at least one or two things going on that you think are interesting, that you think we could localize. So I know I didn't prepare you today, that's fine, but I think we all know what's going on in the world in a broad sense, a dumpster fire. But does anybody want to talk about what current events are going on right now?
Yeah, so right now everyone is getting ready for college night, and I think it would be good to look at the unified leaders and their opinions on having a unified college night, because we haven't done that in forever, So
Yeah.
due to COVID, it sort of twisted things, and it would be good to get their perspective.
Absolutely. So I think that that's a really interesting story. Other than Jonathan, let's talk about this as a class. Who would be some of the sources we could use for a college night feature?
You would definitely go to like the purple and gold side leaders.
Okay, excellent. And what kinds of things would we be wanting to ask those leaders?
I my roommate was in pit course, so this is like last year. So I was like, she was talking to me about how like she's wondering how pit course is going to work. So I thought that could be kind of interesting to put in if we did it.
Absolutely. So, I mean, that could even be its own feature, right? Because pit chorus is a large part of college night. So you could have like this whole feature piece that involves the changes to college night and then do minor sidebars on all of the different ways that this has changed, right? So pit chorus would be a great sidebar piece that we could talk about, since that's a unique aspect of trying to unify that. Very good. All right, what other aspects of college night could we talk about? We have the leaders, we have pit chorus.
Maybe how they're like working to keep people in the production safe during COVID.
Absolutely. I think we have to talk about the safety of those who are actually working the events, even though they're being streamed. What does that look like on the ground? What are their expectations for that? You know, when we're doing Gala Vision News, for instance, in 333, we're having to keep 6 feet apart. Mass, we're having to wipe down all the surfaces. How do you do that for a production? So I think that's a great line of questioning, Angel. What else? What are some other aspects of college night?
I think it'd be interesting to see, like, go behind the scenes, how they're going to stream everything to do it like virtually. I'm kind of curious
Absolutely.
about that.
Yeah, from a production aspect, like what does that involve? Is that a student production? Is that a faculty thing? What types of technology are they using? But then also on the audience side, how does the audience feel about streaming? Do they feel connected to it? Do they think that that's the same as having a true college night experience? Good point, Victoria. Any other aspects of college night?
There could be a follow-up article about the churn up of the virtual event, seeing if students actually attended and what the attendance rate was.
Absolutely. And I think not only looking at the numbers, which could be very interesting in and of itself to do a comparison from year to year, but also just talking about both the positives and negatives of having a virtual experience, because we all know that sometimes you can't get to college night. Maybe you're working, maybe you're doing other things. Maybe you're a commuter and you've never been able to participate in it. So those people who now have unique access to it, how do they feel? What's another aspect of streaming the college night that opens opportunities for different people? What's something new that we'll get this year that we haven't been able to do in the past?
A higher alumni viewing rate.
Alumni are going to be a huge part of this college night, right? Because you know that the alumni love college night. It's like one of the, I'm not an alumni, but trust me, I hear a lot about it. But the alumni will get to watch, and not only alumni, but then also students' parents, right? Or friends and family. It's a national exposure for this nationally recognized event that we've never had before. And so does that put pressure on the event to be better than a traditional in-person college night? So it's great to think about taking a story that's pretty basic. No offense, Jonathan, it was a great starter, but like a basic story of, hey, college night is different, and thinking about it from multiple angles. And how can we build off of this piece? I mean, just based on this 5-minute discussion that we've had on college night, we could put together our own feature segment that has, 5 or 6 different stories on it that you guys could pursue. So these types of brainstorming exercises are meant to draw us to current events, things going on in the news, but they're also meant to show how easy it is to come up with story ideas. I think when I teach 200, a lot of people are hesitant in pitching because they're like, oh, my idea is not good enough, or I don't know if this is really news. Every single thing that you guys just said is newsworthy. And those we're coming up with off the fly. So that can be a great exercise for you to do with classmates or even people who are not in the journalism field. Hey, what's something going on in your life that matters to you? And then how can you turn that into a story? So that's an example of a newsroom huddle that we might do. We can talk about national, international news. We can talk about local news, but just try to come in with to every class with some story ideas, and then be ready to build off of other people's ideas so that we can kind of get the feeling of what a newsroom huddle would be like. So great job. Great first exercise. I think that's the best intro newsroom huddle I've had. So congrats. Good job. All right, so let's dive into chapter 1. Let's ask a very basic question. You guys are studying multimedia journalism in some form or fashion. What is a journalist? This is a conversation piece, by the way. Remember to unmute yourselves. Yeah, go ahead, Caitlin.
Okay, so my gosh, so a journalist is, like, obviously it can be many things, but what I think of a journalist is someone who goes out, gets the information, then brings it back to the newsroom and then talks about it amongst everyone else.
Okay, so and what I'm hearing there is you have an information gatherer, you have someone who works for a news organization, because you said a newsroom, and then they have to disseminate or send out that information to other people through some medium. Okay, I think those are good starter definitions. What else is a journalist?
Someone who has like an ethical responsibility to share the news accurately.
Okay, so now we're kind of getting into some distinguishing factors, right? Because when you guys tweet or TikTok, is that the right verb for TikTok? I TikToked. What's the verb for TikTok? Like I grammed, but I don't know what I TikTok. Anyway, when you post something on TikTok or you tweet or whatever, you are disseminating information, right? You are even information gathering in some instances. So what distinguishes someone who publishes versus a journalist? And I think Olivia brought up a really key word, which is ethics, right? It's someone who is following a set of standard professional and ethical practices to do that work. So when you are tweeting, does someone on Twitter have any ethical standard to post accurate information? I think we can all vigorously shake our head no, looking at the state of Twitter, right? Do they have any ethical obligation to the people that they're writing about? No, we trash people constantly on social media, right? And so it's really these professional standards that will distinguish a true journalist from someone who just shares information. What else about a journalist that we can distinguish?
I always thought, they publish the news, but they keep and you can see that right now, our government officials and people in power accountable.
So one of the, yeah, great point, Jonathan, that the watchdog role of journalism, what we call the fourth estate, is meant to keep people in check, right? Our government, large corporations, things like that. And you're not necessarily doing that day to day by sharing crime news or feature pieces, but think about the amount of information that we are getting from journalists right now about the Capitol riots or investigations into the unfair deaths of minorities, right? The Black Lives Matter movement. There are real solution-based journalism practices that allow us to watchdog government practices, prevent corruption, and point out things that are unfair in society to provide multiple solutions from multiple vantage points. But the key of that is that who is providing the solution? Is it the journalist that provides the solution in those instances? What do you guys think?
No, it's not the journalist, because the journalist isn't supposed to share the opinion. They're just supposed to provide like the information of like what is happening, why it's happening, when it's happening, all the
I think
W&H questions.
Like a call to action. Sort of.
Okay. So it may or may not involve a call to action, but who, Olivia is talking about finding the facts. Who provides us those facts?
Was it like, I don't know specifically, but like, I mean, there are a variety of ways to get, like, you can get it from like town hall meetings and like different events and like over like police radio and stuff, like for different types of events. I guess it depends.
Yeah, absolutely. So sources are where this information comes from. That can look like us attending a public meeting. How many of you have been to a city council meeting just for the kicks, right? Yeah, Jonathan, of course, yes. No, I'm just kidding. But no, we don't typically as citizens go to these government meetings. Instead, we're relying on people to provide us that information. Well, we as journalists use sources like public meetings, like officials, experts. We have people who have been affected by these instances. We have data, documents, things that we dig up. through different sources. So yes, we rely very heavily on sources to tell stories, where that's not necessarily true for everyone who is sharing information. These are great distinguishing characteristics. So in thinking about what separates a journalist from what we think about, Ted Brokaw standing in front of the television versus citizen journalists, which are people who now have platforms on digital spaces to be able to share information with the world. What are those distinguishing characteristics? And we talked about a lot of them. One main thing that this might be controversial in the field, but journalists really need to work for a news outlet. They need to have a credible body or organization behind them. There are some wonderful independent journalists, but they still need a platform that has credibility to share it. And most independent journalists are leaving a news outlet and then get their credibility from their former profession. So really, journalists work for news outlets. We talked about that. I think Caitlin mentioned, being in the newsroom. We gather information. We then organize that information. We're not a press release. We're not just, hey, here are the facts, right? We're organizing it in a way that the typical average person can understand. We're then disseminating it or sharing it out to the public, because if we're just gathering that information and writing the story for ourselves, but no one sees it, it's like if a tree falls in the forest, did anyone hear it? If you don't share your information with the public, is it really journalism? So we also sort through the clutter and we get people news that they need. In the age of digital information, there is so much information out there. And it's our job as journalists to understand what is credible information, what is reliable information, what is information that matters versus this random fact that, scientists may care about, but other people wouldn't. So it's about organizing those facts and sharing what really matters with the public. It's about adding context, because I can tell you how many school shootings that there have been within this year. But if I don't tell you how I'm defining a school shooting, that context can change very quickly, right? Is just bringing a gun on campus and having that gun found considering a shooting? What if it goes off accidentally and doesn't hurt anyone? Is that considered a shooting? So it's providing deeper context for audiences so that they can understand facts and information. We want to practice what Jonathan was talking about, that watchdog investigative journalism, following rigorous reporting techniques and practices to find information in ways that others can't. But like Olivia was saying, we need to do that ethically, right? We cannot hack into the CIA. I'm sorry, I just won't allow it because that's not ethical reporting practice. There are many people who can hack into different government organizations and get information. They're not journalists if they're not acting ethically, because we are bound by the ethics of our profession. We also need to help the public understand issues and make them informed about the decisions that they have. This doesn't mean we tell them what to decide, right? But we can provide them all of the information that is out there, that is reliable, that's been fact checked. And that allows people to make decisions about things like who will they vote for? How will they stand on this amendment that's on the ballot? How will they do this, that, and the other? I see you, Jonathan, 1 second. We also need to be a trustworthy source of information. We need to be a source that people trust and consider credible. And we do that by continuing those rigorous ethical practices. And then finally, we should present that information without bias. And that tip is what we'll be discussing for the rest of the class period. Yes, Jonathan.
So when you were talking about, and I agree with everything you've stated, obviously, but when you were talking about obtaining a source, maybe unethically, I was thinking back to like the Washington Post and what is it called? Watergate. And them, is that so? What's your thoughts on that?
So I don't believe that Watergate was obtained unethically. They still followed very rigorous reporting practices. They took the informant, deep throats information, and they verified it with other sources. They fact checked it before they ever ran it. One interesting thing to note about deep throat, a lot of people talk about these anonymous sources, right? But the very first time that source called Woodward, he said, "Hi, my name is, and I work for this department in the government." He was never an anonymous source to the journalist, but the journalist kept him anonymous for that source's safety. So there were still very rigorous reporting practices that were done ethically, but it's about how much information do you share with the public? And that's something we'll be talking about in our debate about objectivity versus transparency. One of the issues with the argument for transparency in journalism is the protection of sources. So people who are whistleblowers who are trying to inform on the government as a watchdog, how do we protect those people? Or how do we protect sources that can't protect themselves, like people who are being harmed, domestic abuse victims, rape victims who want to come forward and talk, but they want to do so anonymously? If we're required to be transparent, how do we protect those sources? So I think that, you will find situations where there are questions about ethics, and ethics are practices, right? They are guidelines. So there is no black and white answer to ethics. As much as we would love to say this is right and this is wrong, everybody's ethical standards are somewhat different to the degree to which you're willing to move them, right? But as a profession, we are very ethically based. I have never worked in a newsroom where I was not required to confirm everything by two sources before reporting it. And one of those sources could not be another media outlet. You were not allowed to report something just because another media outlet reported it, right? So I think that these are really good starting points, but as we get deeper into discussions of ethics, there are certainly questions that we will each have our own answers to. Does that make sense? Cool, great question. If you like Watergate, if you think that's an interesting topic, if you like investigative journalism, watch The Post. It's a wonderful movie that really delves into some of the ethical and legal decisions that the Washington Post had to make. It's also a great movie. So when we talk about changes that journalism has undergone, it's really important to remember that our industry does not look like it did when I was, working in broadcasting. It doesn't look the same even 5 years later, because we're now competing with digital space. And that means that we're competing with those citizen journalists who have their cell phone, who can record a protest or a riot, they can take pictures, they can report what they're seeing, and they think they're journalists. So how can we distinguish ourselves? And so that's where it comes back to really being a trustworthy, reliable source of information. That involves battling misinformation, not only misinformation that is spread outside by others. We need to correct that with facts, but also ensuring that what we're reporting is to the standards that we need it to be, so it doesn't become misinformation itself. As you all know, we are all dealing with a growing distrust of the media in journalism practice. Audiences since the 70s have been decreasing their trust in journalism. And so we as a profession need to look at how we build that trust back. And a lot of that for our generation is going to be, I say our generation, like I'm Mary Ange, it's cute. A lot of that is going to be battling misinformation online. And so that means sourcing properly. That means being factual in everything we do, increasing our transparency to our practices, being objective instead of sharing bias. So those are all things that we can do to continue to increase the trustworthiness. Thanks, Jojo, for letting me know that. So the other thing to consider is that there are no more beats. If you're going into journalism today, you're most likely going to be doing general assignment reporting, where when I started, I actually went into the field thinking I was going to be a political journalist. I double majored telecommunications and political science. I was very well known for being politically minded. And so I had a heart for being a political reporter. Well, right as I started in the industry, back in 08, that's really when beat assignments started falling off, meaning that there wasn't someone who covered education. There wasn't someone who covered politics or council. Instead, you were doing a news story every single day. That means that we need to become jack of all trades as reporters. We need to know how to cover a city council and cover the economy, cover education. And a lot of times that means knowing a lot or knowing a little about a lot of things. And most of the time that's about digging in through research and doing deeper reporting practices, relying on sources, relying on other people's knowledge rather than your own. So it generally means that you as a journalist will have more responsibility with less staff. And so your generation is not only having to go out and do, if you're in broadcasting, you not only have to do 2 VOSATs in a package within one day and then front them live. So you have to be in front of the camera live to report them. But then you also have to turn around and put those on the website. Then you have to tease them for your show on social media. After the show's over, then you upload your story to social media. You're also responsible for coming up with stories, for doing follow-ups. So there's a lot on journalists today, a lot of responsibilities to take care of. There is also a growing importance for new journalism students to be business-based. We like to think of journalism as a public service, that we are part of the public good, and it doesn't matter whether or not we make money or not. That age of journalism is over because we are competing with websites like BuzzFeed. We are competing with cat videos on YouTube. And we are growing business, or we are losing business quickly because we are not growing in our business-minded practices. So it is increasingly important for you guys to know what social media metrics mean. You guys have grown up with social media, so you know what a like is, you know how to share something, you know how to comment on something, but how do you convert those into money? How do you make that worthy for your business or your news organization? That's something we're going to be talking about a lot in the class, but it's something that we need to be focused on. That news is a product that we need to share with the public. So unfortunately, as much as I would love to just be journalism as a public service, we also have to think about how do we gain audiences and money as well. That involves self-branding as a journalist. So you need to have your own social media platforms. That means you need to be growing your audience on those social media platforms, because the more people that follow you, the more people see your story, the more business you get, the more worthwhile you are in the industry. Right now in my former station at NBC 13 in Birmingham, they have 2 television monitors that all they do is watch the social media metrics of the journalists in the newsroom. So every single day, they have a ranking in the newsroom of who the top performing journalists are on their social media platforms from 1 to bottom. They say that that doesn't build into your work performance, but if you're number 1 every single week on social media, that matters. That's going to matter in your reviews for your job. That's going to matter when you're talking about your contract, about whether or not they are going to keep you when layoffs come. So you want to be social media savvy. You want to build a brand. By the way, the second TV is their owners. So the people that own them, they have a ranking of people all across the country who are all under that ownership. And if you can make that big TV of the national ownership, that's big. So social media and self-branding are becoming increasingly important. And that's why I also require you guys to do digital and social media stories along with these feature pieces. So we also need to remember that the delivery of news is immediate. There's no more waiting until it prints the next day. We have to continually update our information, and we have to be willing to do it through convergent media practice, meaning if you want to be a print journalist, you better know how to do digital. You better know how to do video. You need to know how to record audio. If you're a broadcaster, you also need to know how to write in the digital space, right? Because all of these practices are coming together as part of the growing business of journalism. And that's what I hope to train you guys in. So you're not pigeonholing yourself and losing out on these skills that you really need. Other things that we need to talk about with changing journalism is that the audience has become increasingly important. It's no longer reporting what we think people need to hear, but it's also reporting what they want to hear. And it's trying to blend both while still remaining a good public servant. So a lot of times that means niche publications, especially for feature digital reporting. You will have an entire publication dedicated to fishing. I love fishing. It's a great hobby, but I cannot imagine producing a monthly magazine with many, many pages and all you talk about is fishing, right? Or painting or SEEP. I'm sure there are tons of soccer publications, right? So it's all about this niche reporting, finding what your audience really cares about and catering to that while still maintaining your ethical practices. Local becomes increasingly important in this as well, because do you as a Birmingham journalist really need to report national news? It's probably less important, because can people get the national news from other sources, which probably has better reporting than what you could do sitting in a newsroom in Birmingham? Yeah, so we put less emphasis on national news and really focus on hyper local pieces, because that's the news people can't get anywhere else except your publication. But we always need to keep in mind that what we publish, even on the Alabamian, has national reach. So if someone, in DC sees an article published in the Alabamian, they have every right to read and react to and use what you're writing on a local level, on a higher level as well. So never think that you're only talking to a local audience. You're also speaking to a national one as well. So audience interactions really do matter. We have to think about whether or not our page is going to have comments, whether you turn on comments on your personal pages, because that can open up to some creepy people or some very combative people. We need to think about how we follow up stories through audience interaction, asking people to become sources for your story, right? If we were taking our college night example, we might want to put out on our social media profile, hey, I'm looking for alumni who are hoping to watch college night. Write me back if you're interested in speaking to me, right? So we're getting this new tool to be able to gather sources that we might not be exposed to without social media. And then, of course, branding really matters with your audience. They want to connect to you. They want to feel like they know you. They want to feel like they trust you. And that's part of building it as well. I scared my capstone class to death with journalist safety. I showed them a video of a journalist during the George Floyd protest here in Birmingham, where a 3340 reporter got hit in the head with a bottle, and how we need to protect ourselves better as journalists. That happens both in person, covering things that we need more than ever to be aware of our safety, but it also happens online. And we have a lot of women in this class. This also applies to the men, but happens less often for male reporters. But the business of news attracts really bad people sometimes. And 73% of female journalists say that they have received a form of online harassment just for doing their jobs. So it's going to be about protecting yourself through privacy and safety standards, making sure you're not posting things like your address, as silly as that seems. I had a friend in the early days of social media reporting who talked about her neighborhood, right? She was just saying, hey, I live in this neighborhood and they have really cool Christmas lights. And someone came and tried to find her house, right? And so it's about thinking more about journalist safety than we ever have had to before. So these are changes that are currently happening in journalism that we as early career journalists need to understand. Now, of course, we know that this key word, fake news, has been thrown around a lot, and it's one of the biggest challenges to our industry right now because misinformation has been happening since forever, right? Since Greek and Roman times. But because we now have labels for it, and because there is so much information out there, it's becoming increasingly important to know what is true and what is not, both as media consumers, people who watch journalism and read it, but also as people who produce media. How do we decrease our likelihood of sharing misinformation? So there's key definitions that I want you guys to know the difference of. Misinformation is different than disinformation, but lately they have been used as, two similar terms interchangeably. That's not true. So misinformation is a large umbrella term, right? It is any amount of false information that is spread, regardless of whether that information was meant to harm someone else or not. So if you have a typo in a story that you're producing, you could be sharing misinformation if it makes that, sentence or word change. You have just shared misinformation. Did you mean to share bad information? No, it was an accident. It was an error, right? So that would be misinformation. That's not what we call fake news, as we like to call it, right? What fake news is disinformation. Disinformation is it's like one of the arms of the umbrella. It's a type of misinformation. Disinformation is deliberately misleading or biased information. It's when you have manipulated the story or the facts. You've changed the context, or you're creating propaganda, which means that you're supporting something more heavily than another, and really encouraging bias. So, we say that there is this spread of misinformation, and there really is. But just because you're sharing inaccurate information doesn't mean that there is an intent to harm. So when we talk about the media's bias and the media does this and they do that, a lot of what local media specifically, I'm not talking about like your Fox News or your CNN, a lot of what they're doing is sharing misinformation. They're not checking their sources reliably enough. They're not, editing themselves to make sure that the information they're sharing is accurate. But they're not doing it on purpose. I've worked in journalism for 13 years, been a part of the field for almost 20. God, I'm getting so old. The people that you work with in journalism are some of the best people in the world, right? And I mean that. There are very few people in journalism who are just plain out bad people. There is very rarely an intent to harm. Disinformation does happen in media, but it happens less regularly within the profession. A lot of times it happens with those community journalists, people who are calling themselves journalists, but aren't. So it's important that we distinguish these two types. So now I'm going to talk about the 7 types of mis and disinformation with a couple of examples to help you guys understand what I'm talking about. Do you guys know what satire websites are? What's your favorite? There's lots, and it could be a show or a website.
I like The Onion.
This article is from The Onion. I've been selfish and arrogant, and I apologize, says a content and mentally healthy Trump minutes after his social media ban. Does anyone actually believe that this statement happened? No, it is satire. It's meant to be humor. So The Onion, or its Alabamian cousin, The Ostrich, right? They report fake news on purpose for humor. The Trevor Noah Show, for instance, is entertainment news meant to be satire. It's meant to be parody. It's funny. But the problem is, if you just looked at this article, would you automatically know it's satire? Are there any indications that it's satire? So by not distinguishing itself, it becomes a form of misinformation. Some may even argue disinformation because it's intending to share false information. Now it's for a laugh. It's not meant to harm, but it does do harm when we don't distinguish. By the way, I love The Onion and I love Trevor Noah. It's just, parody. So misleading content. This is when bias creeps in to a degree that you're changing the focus or the framing of the story to support one side over the other. So these stories, these websites are from Slate and Breitbart. What lean does Slate have? Liberal or Republican? Anyone know?
I'm guessing based on the headline that it's liberal.
Very good. Using context clues. I love it. And then Breitbart is known as one of the most far right in terms of media bias lean. You can always look at the media bias chart too. If you're not sure if a source is left or right leaning, there is a chart where they put the different logos of all different media types, both print, digital, and broadcast. That is a wonderful resource for you to use in looking at misinformation. But anyway, they're covering the same story, right? But look at how different these stories look. This is misleading content because they are purposely trying to get you to look one way or the other. And this, unfortunately, is why a lot of distrust in the media is happening. But this information isn't necessarily wrong either. Look at the actual facts of the story. The facts are not wrong. They're just misleading because they're pointing you in one direction and not sharing the balance of the other side. Misleading content can also be in the way that you change the frame of a story. This is the exact same story shared by the exact same owners on two different outlets. Fox News Latino, what do they emphasize in this story?
Undocumented.
There is a different descriptor, undocumented versus illegals. Jonathan?
It looks like it's just framed as like sort of a charity. I don't know, like it's
a scholarship. It's a good thing, right? Yeah. The top one is a feature piece because they know that Latino audiences, Latinx audiences are going to like this story. But Fox News's audience that happens to be more conservative leaning, they frame the story as money to illegals, as if it were a negative, right? Also notice the different use of the word undocumented versus illegal. This is the exact same news organization. So this content would be considered misleading because you can see the facts of the story are the same, but its representation are different. Imposter news is that news that is meant to look like an existing organization or person that a fake account comes along to mimic it. And this is disinformation. This is absolutely someone trying to harm, right? Is this CNN's website? This is not the correct CNN News logo. This is not what their headline looks like, their header bar looks like. But if you were looking at it real quick, could it look like CNN? Yeah. HIV was never found in bananas at Walmart. Okay, so like hopefully your common sense kicks in at that point, but unfortunately many people don't have media literacy. They don't have common sense. But this can happen with real people too. Dave Ramsey is a financial expert, and during the Capitol riots, someone was posting as Dave Ramsey, not Dave Ramsey, saying that he supported the protesters, right? Which pulls his credibility and reliability into question. That happens a lot with journalists too, when they become pretty famous. Even a local reporter that I spoke to said a parody account was made of him, where it was actually a bunch of high school students. They found him. He was laughing about it because it wasn't that serious. But this parody account was made with his name on it, and there can be bad consequences for that. So we need to be aware of that. There's fabricated news, which is a form of disinformation. That's when you just make up a story just for the sake of making up things. None of these facts are true. Pope Francis never endorsed President Trump, ever. But the problem is, this is also a fabricated website. It's shoot, what did I just call it? Imposter website. Because look, it looks exactly like a local news website. Do you know how many times the story was shared? Millions and millions of times the story, which is disinformation, was shared on the internet, including by national news outlets, because they didn't verify it. So this is the danger of fake news. It spreads quickly. False connection is taking something out of context to make it purposefully misleading. Does anybody know what this picture is of? Does anybody remember this case? Is that lion really hugging this person? This is moments before this man is mauled and killed. Okay, so a man tries to hug a wild lion. You won't believe what happens next. This is clickbait. Okay, it's when they make a headline to make you interested in it because you now want to know what happens next. But they're saying that he was hugging a lion. No, he was attacked. So it's a false connection just to make you click on it. Similarly, taking a photo out of context and using it for something else. This photo was actually taken in Vietnam in 2007 to discuss poverty conditions in Vietnam. But then it recirculated in 2015 by news organizations saying that it was showing the devastation in Nepal. Nepal and Vietnam are not the same place, P.S. And it's 8 years apart, right? But taken out of context, this could look like that situation. So this is another form of disinformation when you're purposefully using something to make it seem like something else. And now today, even the words that you use make something a false connection. This is BBC News, one of the most respected news outlets in the world. A supporter of the former Georgian president clash with the police officers in Kiev. What's that protester doing? Is he actively clashing with police? No, the police are clashing with the protester, right? So by writing this in the reverse, they're taking it out of context and making it misleading, right? Okay. Now, manipulated content is something that is very, very scary. It's crazy how close they can become, but it's changing how you see something. You can see by editing this photo, it changes the meaning, right? This is the actual photo. This one makes it look like the soldier was about to shoot him. This one looks like it was humanitarian aid, just based on a simple cropping of a photo. That's manipulated content. This is manipulated to make it seem like because Stacey Abrams was taking a photo with a Muslim woman, that they were saying that her sign said she was a communist and part of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's obviously manipulated. That's not what the original photo looked like. So that is disinformation as well. And then we can even alter video. If you've never seen stuff like this, it's very scary. And of course, I have to have a long ad. Sorry, y'all. It's free, y'all. All right. Oop.
Hear it.
Oh, you can't hear it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I will post this video because this is a deep fake. It's where Jordan Peele was superimposing his image onto President Obama and making him say things that he didn't really say. And that does happen. And fake news matters because us as media consumers don't want to be duped. We don't want to be, we don't want to fall prey to misinformation. And then we as journalists use digital content as sources. So it affects our trustworthiness and credibility when we use misinformation or we share it. So in order to fight misinformation, there's tons of stuff we can do. I will actually pick this back up on Friday because I know we are at time.